Hello and welcome again to another edition of Strategic Studies Quarterly Issues and Answers. Today the issue, cyber, or cyberspace if you prefer. Over the last 20 years, cyber capabilities, threats, and vulnerabilities have been ubiquitous in our national security discussions and also critical to our national defense. Here to examine many of the aspects of the cyber domain is my guest, Dr. Panagiotis Giannakos-Georgos. He is the Dean of the Air Force's Cyber College. He holds a PhD in Global Affairs from Rutgers University and is a widely published author on cybersecurity. Pano, welcome to Issues and Answers.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Now, you know, we've published a lot on cyber. We've published 2 special editions, in fact, on cyber over the last 12 years. And in almost every edition of Strategic Studies Quarterly, we have our articles addressing some aspect of cyber. So let's get into a couple of issues and answers on that topic. First, I'd like you to give us an overview of what you see are some of the greatest threats facing the United States in cyber. Would you be able to classify those as hackers, criminals, or our adversaries?
So I'm going to break it down, Mike, into an actual threat probability. So what we see right now, the greatest threat to the United States comes from criminal actors who are looking for profit by stealing people's personal identifiable information and reselling it on the dark web, or just stealing money straight out of people's bank accounts. So that's what we currently see right now as the greatest threat to the civilian population. However, we also have another greater threat to U.S. national security, which can be broken down into nation-state sponsored activities. One is the Chinese theft of intellectual property from U.S. corporations, including defense contractors. And then the other is actually the targeting of the electoral process by the Russians, as is well known. So on the Chinese side, for me, that's the more, the greater threat of all, because at the end of the day, our American companies are innovating, putting a lot of investments in research and development into research and development. And as a result, when the Chinese steal that money, they don't have to put that investment in. They can recreate the products like the C-17, which was redeveloped as the Y-17 aircraft, and not have to actually go out and do all the hard work themselves. So they're almost able to leapfrog our military capability. So the United States effectively becomes a Chinese research and development laboratory.
So it sounds like the threat is I will call it a conglomeration of threats. And you mentioned on the civil side particularly first. So what would you consider the weakest link in that civilian side of this vulnerability?
The weakest link are the platforms and the software. So by platforms, I mean the hardware that corporations create and deliver into the market, and the software that creates the applications that allows user to interact with each other across the world. So over the past 3 decades and the brief history of cyberspace that we have, industry has not provided us with software and hardware that is secure by design. They're more interested in getting their products out to market, and as a result, they don't conduct the best coding practices to make sure that their software is secure. And as a result, this vulnerability proliferates throughout society, and that's what I believe the greatest vulnerability is right now, the actual software and hardware that exists in the consumer market today.
Maybe the answer to this next question may be quite obvious, but how would you decrease that vulnerability? What would you propose to decrease that while still maintaining cyber efficiency or effectiveness?
Right, and to be fair, to follow on, it's a hard problem because the gross national product is dependent on our IT services, so we can't expect them to decrease their profit margin by taking time to produce that hardware and software that's secure. What can be done today, though, is that the consumers, either at a personal level or at an enterprise level or at a U.S. government military level, can start asking through a contract for companies to implement cybersecurity features by design or by implementation into the products that are being delivered to large corporations.
To make that a requirement.
Correct.
Well, you mentioned the government in there, so that's sort of the lead into my next question is, where do you think the DoD itself is most vulnerable and why?
So that's a very interesting question. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, issued a report back in October 2018 that covers cyber weapons, cyber vulnerabilities in weapon systems. And it's a long and lengthy report, and I'll just summarize the gist of it, is that is probably the greatest risk right now that the DoD faces, the actual cyber vulnerabilities within our military platforms that could potentially be exploited by a threat actor.
That have some of those vulnerabilities that the companies produced initially. It makes sense. Okay, same question. On the DoD side, what should we do? What's the best way to fix those vulnerabilities? And what's not being done now that we should be doing?
The one thing is to focus on, again, the contractual relationship we have with companies. We need to educate and train our lawyers, our acquisitions professionals, to be cyber savvy and to understand what key performance parameters can be included in a DoD acquisition contract that could hold a company culpable or liable for hacks that happen as a result of poorly designed systems or systems that did not have cybersecurity designed within them. There are certain steps that are being taken right now within DoD to actually start processes like this, but it needs to be encultured within the acquisitions and the legal communities.
So we're not at that level quite yet.
No.
Do we have the right talent to get to that level? And if we don't, how do we get it?
So educating those non-cyber career fields is the most important thing, and the Air Force is headed in the right direction with the stand-up of the Air Force Cyber College, where educating the legal communities, acquisitions communities, and others on how to start asking the right questions to start reshaping the technical environment at a policy and strategic level.
Well, I'm going to ask this next question, and it has to do with Congress. We've seen a lot of action from Congress over the past few years. Is that level of involvement, congressional oversight, in your opinion, is it too little, too much, or just too late?
I think it's just right. I'll stick with that from the Goldilocks paradigm. So you don't want Congress to get too heavily involved in offering regulations because that could genuinely stifle innovation. I think a softer carrot and stick approach is to try to reshape the environment through measures such as redefining the acquisitions process and things like that. If the environment doesn't improve over time, then it might be the right opportunity to ask Congress to do more. They have been including the right language, the appropriate language in the most recent National Defense Authorization Acts. And right now that's been a great way to kind of signal to industry and also within the DoD of the importance that cybersecurity and cyber mission assurance should be taking for the DoD.
I know you've heard and read a lot about this next topic. It's more of a specific nature to one of the concerns some people have in cyber in the United States right now, and that's the issue of Huawei, the Chinese company Huawei, and its 5G network. Is that really something we should be concerned about or worry about?
Absolutely. So, I'll give you an example. Let's not use the 5G network as an example. Let's just take it up a higher level and talk about the Chinese behavior currently in cyberspace. The Chinese have been pilfering intellectual property using existing networks that they don't own and control, like Cisco routers they haven't developed and other things like that, in order to steal secrets, to actively and aggressively go after intellectual property. If they now have an additional level of control over the physical infrastructure through Huawei's 5G equipment, I'm pretty sure their strategic culture is not automatically going to shift overnight. And they're going to say, okay, now that we have Huawei in your networks, we're going to stop hacking you. So I'm pretty sure the trend that we've seen in the past will only be amplified as a result of more and more Chinese equipment being put on networks globally.
So it sounds like that risk is pretty great.
Absolutely.
In the winter of 2019 edition, the winter 2019 edition, the upcoming edition, the end of this year, will be a special edition on great power conflict. Can you briefly mention how you think cyber may play out or play a part in a great power conflict, maybe before, during, and after a great power conflict?
Absolutely. So the kind of break it down into two ways, the cyber catastrophe or the cyber peacemaker. And the cyber peacemaker is more of a tongue-in-cheek, but I'll start with the cyber catastrophe. Before the great power conflict, nation states will have been implanting software on each other's critical infrastructure. They will have been stealing information from each other to better understand their military plans, policies, procedures. They will have developed equipment based on America's greater technological innovations and copied it. And so when the great power conflict starts, they'll take all the advantage that they've had in cyberspace and start acting on it. So the military secrets or political secrets that they would have stolen, they'll be able to reshape their own military strategies to best counter ours. The military platforms that they will have developed as a result of stealing our military developmental secrets will enable them to better, to have equipment that is as capable or more capable than our own on the battlefield. So that's the cyber catastrophe scenario, where things are going on in the traditional domains of warfare, and then at the same time, with all those implants that have been planted across the cyber domain, things could start exploding and have kinetic effects as a result of someone on the other side of the world pushing a button. But the thing is, with great power conflict, you have all sides doing this to each other. So this is where my cyber pacifier example comes in, where you have all the airplanes and all the modern military equipment taken off, and because the hackers have been so good at what they do, they just turn around and land again or crash. And as a result, there is no conflict as a result of the adeptness of great powers to hack each other.
I like the way you characterize that as cyber pacifism. Last question. You and I have talked before, and we've published several pieces on the offensive nature of cyber, offensive cyber capabilities, particularly hackbacks. And I remember you sharing some thoughts on that several years ago. What are your thoughts on the subject now? The subject of hackback and or offensive cyber operations. We've just seen the president recently, within the last year, saying, you know, the military, we're going to sort of release you to do more of these kinds of things. And very recently in the news, we've seen some examples of that. So what are your thoughts on offensive cyber?
I think there's too much attention paid to offensive cyber. I'll start there. The world, around the world, countries are developing cyber commands or something that looks like a cyber command. And a lot of the purpose of the cyber command is to start trying to think of offensive ways to integrate cyber into military operations. I think the better thing to do to create a more stable global cyberspace is to focus on defensive measures like the United States is doing. When we're talking about the American Cyber Command, we're focused on cyber protection teams and things that are being done in order to defend our assets and ensure that our military operations can achieve the commander's intent. So that's my own personal view of where we think. But now the general my general thoughts on offensive cyber are that if countries and nation states try to develop offensive cyber capabilities, they have two real models to look after. First is Stuxnet, and the second is NotPetya. Stuxnet example is one that had a cyber capability that was deployed against an illegal nuclear activity within Iran. It was meant to disrupt the program in accordance with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. When it got out into the wild and spread around the world, there was no effect. It just laid there dormantly on systems worldwide. So that's an example of a offensive cyber capability that states can look at as a model for what a responsible way of using a cyber weapon is. An irresponsible way is NotPetya. NotPetya was where the Russians hacked into a Ukrainian tax software that the Ukrainians used in order to conduct a ransomware attack. NotPetya went beyond the borders of the Ukraine and went around the world. It caused millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in economic damage worldwide because it was ransoming everything it touched. So that's an example of a offensive cyber capability that is irresponsible and could actually be leveled at a war crime, because at the end of the day, anything that a military fields in cyberspace has to abide by international laws and rules and norms of responsible state behavior and also laws of armed conflict. The hackback question is a perplexing one, because by that I understand it to mean private sector hackbacks. So a company gets hacked and lots of companies are demanding that they have the right to hack back. I think that's a very dangerous situation, because you want to allow the state to still have monopoly over the use of force, over having legitimate law enforcement mechanisms to tackle hacker organizations. If we start to allow private companies to go out and cause disruptive activities to counter hackers that are attacking their networks, there could be broader implications that create more instability in the domain as a result.
Well, it sounds pretty scary, and in the last few minutes you've given us a lot to think about. I suspect that cyber will remain very important to our national security and to our lives. So on behalf of Team SSQ and the entire SSQ audience, Pano, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me again.
My pleasure.